Hello and welcome to Florida Basketball Hour. I am Neil Blackman, Saturday Down South. On this episode, Eric Fawcett and I are going to break down Florida's uh, 77-75 second round win over UConn. Obviously, an absolutely thrilling game. Many of you know now, if you've listened to the show a long time or if you follow us on Twitter, that I did not actually get to watch this game live. I ended up watching a recording of this game, which I watched in two sessions. One where I watched a half, and then another where I watched another half. And I split those up by several hours. And all I can say was to those that think that it spared my nerves a little bit or something like that to not actually watch the Gators play in the NCAA tournament, all I'll say is that in 1999, when I actually had a basketball game, is the last time that I missed. I had a basketball game of my own to attend. It was the last time that I did not see Florida play live in the NCAA tournament. And so, no, it was not less stressful for me to not watch the game. And arguably it was worse to some extent, only because I'm celebrating my daughter Lizzie actually turns 10 on the 27th, so in like 2 days. But we celebrated her birthday this weekend at Epcot, and we went out to one of these like character dining experiences, and like the game's going on, and I've got like my notifications silenced, like I'm not looking at my phone, like just put it away. And my wife's like kind of teasing me even a little, like she's like, "Do you know what the score is?" I'm like, "No," and she's just like making like deadpan poker faces at me. So at 4 o'clock, or not 4 o'clock, at 2 o'clock, I had my phone was silenced from 12:10 to 2:10. So at 2:10, I turned the silence came off. I didn't turn it off; it just went off automatically. And suddenly, I have like 177 messages, and the score comes up. And at that point, at 2:10 p.m., it is 62-61 Florida. And I'm just like, oh my God, what has just transpired? So anyway, this is kind of the story of how all that happened. Luckily, we had my man Eric Fawcett, GatorCountry.com, burner ball, holding down the fort, producing mountains of content, more of which is coming tomorrow as we get into the Sweet 16. But he held down the fort, and I finally did get to watch the game. Just an epic high level NCAA tournament game, honestly.
Yeah, in a weekend that didn't have a ton of really great games, I thought this was a really good one. And I know that some people just want to see the Gators win every game by 100, and if it's close, that's stressful and maybe not great. But I think that if you were to just look at this one like as objectively as possible, I mean, to see this game that was so close throughout, and that's why I was so curious, Neil, if you were watching the score or not while you were at Disney, because it just was one of those games that was just extra excruciating because there's so many ways to get to a one or two possession game. And I feel like often that is a team goes on one run midway through the first and goes up by 8 or 9. And then you kind of see that lead shrink to 3, then go back to 8, then shrink to 4, then go up to 10, then shrink to 5. But like generally speaking, there's one team that kind of is controlling things. And this game just didn't have that for much of it. I mean, again, UConn did end up taking it for much of the second, holding on to a slight lead. But I just thought this would have been the kind of game that would be excruciating to watch based exclusively on the score or play by play. And while I use it as an example of thinking about how excruciating it must have been while you were in whatever the Mexico pavilion or whatever you were doing at the time, I think it also did speak to a game that was really good, and it wasn't teams trading kill shots while the other team was playing sloppy. It just felt like every time there was a score, the team who scored really earned it, and anytime there was a stop, it seemed like that team earned it. And yeah, so I thought it was a really, really good game. And again, it was immensely stressful. I'm laughing now. I see the comment from Jared, who I also think may have commented. I forget if it was him or someone else who commented on the Patreon. But I did the film study for the UConn game, and I think he said it was like just as stressful watching it again, despite knowing the outcome. And I think that says something about the game too. But yeah, I really understand that for so many of you, like, let's be honest, this isn't a podcast for casual basketball fans. I think I'm sure we have some casuals that are tuning in, and that's awesome. We are the more the merrier, man. Everyone who's at all a Florida fan, like, yeah, come and jump on and cheer for this team. But I do acknowledge that this is the product we have created is largely for the really intense fan. And if you're, especially if you're subscribed to us on Patreon, you're probably a real Florida basketball fan. And I really do understand that if you're in that boat, you have waited a long time for a team that you thought could really win the national championship. So I did really want to make sure I got lots of Patreon content up and a real variety of it. So in the hours following the game, I did the film study for breaking down what happened, how Florida's defense was kind of structured and how they made changes to kind of handle UConn, how UConn was able to score a little bit, and ultimately what Florida did in crunch time with Walter Clayton to pull away. So I did that in the film study. I broke it down with Brian Ralph, who's just, for any of you who don't know, I mean, he's just one of my favorite writers in all of the college basketball media landscape. And he lives in Raleigh. So he was actually at the game, which was awesome. And he gave me some time he was one of the last guys left in the media room there. So I was thankful for that. I broke it down. I did another video with Sam Fetterman, who actually covered Walter Clayton Jr. at Iona. So yeah, there was all, and then of course I had Malik on to get the that perspective as well. And I know a lot of people have actually really enjoyed the Malik stuff, which is awesome because I've had him on twice in the last week, really, and he gives a perspective that's just so different. So yeah, there's that is all the plugs for what we did post UConn. And yeah, there's yeah, well, I mean, we'll of course get to our Maryland preview, but there will be multiple preview videos for Maryland, film wise and others. So man, the Patreon content there's just a mountain of it right now, and it was important to me to be able to get a bunch of stuff up, just knowing what this team means to all of you. So yeah, so Neil, just getting back to the game, I mean, it's interesting, and I think that your perspective coming back to watch it, knowing the result is going to be fascinating, because I do feel it's always different experiencing a game, especially a big game, when you know the score and coming to it with I'm sure you had seen some things on Twitter and knowing some of those moments and just being able to kind of go through with a little bit of a finer tooth comb, having that knowledge. But it was interesting because it was one of those games that was so close, but I still felt like Florida was for much of it. I really thought Florida was going to win. I pointed out some of those moments in the UConn film study. I think, there's a moment, a couple of the balls bounced Florida's way, or UConn did create an open shot and missed it, which there was a lot of, and Florida hit a tough one on the other end. And I did feel like Florida was going to come out victorious, but at the same time, man, getting pushed by a lower seed in the NCAA tournament, it's a unique feeling, and one that Florida has not felt as a championship contender in quite a long time.
Yeah, that's great stuff. And I did get to listen to you and Brian before I viewed any of it, which I thought was good. It kind of gave me a lens in which I could look at some things that were happening game flow wise and like enjoy it that way, since I knew what the result was. And yeah, it was Ed Quigley and Richard Coker, both on the Patreon, two longtime Patreon drivers. I loved Richard's comment. He said, somehow my anxiety rose again watching that. And he said, once Florida got the lead, it felt like a release. And like, I felt that in the first half. Like, even knowing the result, the first half of that game certainly made me anxious a little bit because like it was all the things that Florida does wrong when things actually go wrong for them. That's not to take away anything from Danny Hurley's game plan. And I've been on enough. I've done radio in like Knoxville and Atlanta, and in the Newark market today, which was a big deal for me. But getting to anytime you get a New York market spot, but one thing I said on those shows was like Danny Hurley went into this game. He knew that a lot of people picked Florida to win the national championship. He knew that 25% of brackets or something had Florida in the Final Four, which I thought was a low number, but is the right number. And, you know, I had already seen his reaction after the game, not the video that went viral, but rather like the crying and the talking about losing with honor. Like to him, it was this rare opportunity for UConn to kind of play the underdog card, and they seemed like they really liked it. And they also put together a really good plan. I thought they ran some really good stuff. I'll get into kind of what went wrong initially, but the first thing was they just killed Florida in switches, which actually has been a little bit of a problem for Florida at times this year. Is when Florida has switched a lot, those have been their less good defensive games. And when Florida has switched less and sat in the gaps more, those have been their better games. But UConn personnel-wise, right? Like I know that I loved how Bill Raftery was loving on Hassan Diarra, and I'm like, man, that guy's not it. Like he is not the type of player that Florida was scared enough of defensively to actually sit in the gaps. Like they were doing that against Akai Ziegler. They were doing that against Jalen Murray of Ole Miss. They were doing that against blanking on Mark Sears. Like Florida was playing that style of defense and switching a little less in those games. And UConn and Hurley just murdered Florida on switches. Like a lot of their baskets, I thought, and open looks they created off switches where they just didn't make shots. A lot of that went down. And then Florida with the 9 turnovers, which I think tied for second most that they'd had in a half. They actually had 10 in the first half against Missouri at the SEC tournament, which you could attribute to Missouri or rust or whatever you want to attribute to, but they didn't play very well. The point is, like, that combination, like Florida high turnovers, which has not been a real big problem for this team. They average 11 at the tempo they play. That's pretty good. And then just defensive lapses and from good players too. Like Solo Ball hit a 3 where nobody really communicated. And then Elijah Martin was late getting over a screen. Right. And like, we talked a lot about how Elijah can be really, really good on the ball. And then Eric's talked about how actually he can be a really great help defender. Well, he just didn't fight over a screen hard enough because he was late to react to like the action. So like those sorts of things happened, and that was hard to watch the first time. And then the other thing was, and I don't think this is a terrible hot take, and it didn't get a ton better for him in the second half, but Florida switching a little less made it a little better, was Alex Condon, and just how Florida's going to need a better version of him. And I don't want to talk about Maryland or any of that yet, but I think they'll need a better version of him in the second weekend. But for those that were like totally panicked about Alex Condon getting drafted in the first round, like this was an illuminating game, because one of the arguments for him being like a lottery pick or a late first round draft pick right now is, well, maybe we can play him at the 4 or some too. And like my brothers in Christ, Alex Condon is not ready to play any 4 in the NBA. And like this was the film that will lock up his return as a junior. Like they just got Alex Condon in space and abused him. And had they made more shots, kind of my takes in the first half. And yet Florida went into halftime tied. Right. And like lots went wrong. I don't feel that way about the second half, but I want to stop talking for a second to just kind of reiterate those couple points. Like good plan by Dan Hurley when extremely motivated to come up with a good plan. Condon really rough half. Elijah Martin obviously kept Florida in the game offensively, kind of a rough half defensively. Yeah, I mean, those are like my overarching thoughts. And then I just thought Florida, I understand why they switched. I do, right? Like, I just don't think dribble penetration is terribly scary against Connecticut. So why not switch the on ball actions? And I'm sure Florida worked on this more than 2 days, like the short rest days. They just weren't. But yeah, I mean, things went wrong in the first half. And so suddenly you're in a dogfight with a team that has guys that have won 2 consecutive national championships on their roster. So like they started to have belief, and that was a scary thing.
Yeah, I think that again, just playing against a UConn team where they are obviously run so much offense, are so known for all that they do in terms of really complicated sets. You switch all those and you don't feel like you have to be as tight guarding them. But it's which again I think to some extent has positive results. There's times that works. There's also times that when you blow that up, you give up wide open threes. And again, there is definitely a universe where Florida loses this game. Like, and that's the thing that is terrifying when you go back and watch the film is like the quality of shot that UConn was missing. There was a lot of open catch and shoot set foot shots from guys that are very good shooters that didn't fall. And again, to me, I've mentioned this on film studies on the Patreon in the past, but the moment you see Will Richard and Elijah Martin pointing, that's usually when they're in scramble mode and they do not communicate well enough. And
yes,
it just seems to be that's the pretty clear indication when you watch a lot of Florida's messing up in switches is the moment you start to see Elijah Martin and Will Richard particularly pointing. And they're when they're pointing, they're not really talking and they're not doing. So that was something that I've mentioned in the past. Is so some Patreon members will remember that and have that to look for. And that that just certainly seemed to be the case. And again, I know a lot of people push back on something I've said about how I just didn't think that this UConn roster was very talented. And I understand that there's a lot of recruits that are top 100 recruits. And I hate to like sound like I'm just like pushing back at the only objective measure we have of talent. And I think when I've seen guys like the Gators or breakdown guys do it on the football side, and I'm not, as people know, I'm not knowledgeable on football, but it seems to like make sense a lot more. And the high school recruiting rankings seem to bear out a lot who the most talented teams are. Like I'm just sorry looking at these UConn teams, like you said, like how few guys they have that can do anything off the dribble, how undersized they are on the wings, how unathletic they are. Like, yeah, you can point to whatever. Like I think Solo Ball's a good player, and yeah, he was a top 50 player. But if you were to go look at like Miro Little and you know, some of those players that were around him in the recruiting rankings. I'm trying to go off my like memory of top 50 players. But again, I just don't think in basketball you can look at recruiting rankings and in good faith that think that that's a pretty good, like accurate way of how talented this team is. And yeah, I will stand by it as much as I sound like a science denier pushing back on the recruiting rankings that show that UConn's guys are a bunch of top 100 guys. Like, and again, I did think that was apparent in when you saw Florida's speed, shot making, athleticism, size versus that UConn team. So I do think Florida keeping in their kind of base defense would have been more successful. But I also understand the idea of like, hey, we're playing UConn. We are never going to be able to prepare for all these sets they run. Let's try to switch and see if we can mess up some of their sets. The thing I just don't know if they calculated for as much was the fact that this is what everyone does to UConn. So UConn knows how to attack it.
right.
And again, I do think that the shot quality that UConn was getting consistently was really good. And there was again some, and I don't think anyone on the Gators played particularly poorly defensively, but again, it was just one of those things where one team's defined offensive style was probably a little bit better than one's defensive style, but also the game of basketball is such where that doesn't always indicate who wins the game in the end. And Florida was able to rebound well enough when they needed to, scramble enough when they needed to, got a little bit lucky with UConn missing shots, but ultimately, maybe even just like the wake up call they need going forward to play. Of course, only other good teams moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, like I think it's like a lot of champions have these wake up calls, and that gets into my kind of thoughts on the second half. Was that like to the extent that Elijah Martin kind of kept this team afloat in the first half offensively by being aggressive too, by the way, and just attacking and using his athleticism to like win mismatches against less athletic players, to Eric's point. Florida won in the second half because like their talent won out. I thought they did make some nice offensive adjustments, which have been pointed out in some of the Patreon content. So go to patreon.com/FloridaBBHour. If you're not already a subscriber, and subscribe ahead of the Sweet 16 and the rest of this March run. Again, patreon.com/FloridaBBHour. Your $3, $5 tier is going to get you most everything. Content-wise, your $2 tiers will get you your game previews and your immediate recaps. So you will have those opportunities as well. But I thought in the second half, like Florida did make some adjustments and play better offense, run better offense. I also thought that, Florida started having success. And the main adjustment was Florida started really having success on slips, because this was the first game where someone sort of adjusted to Florida's adjustment to having ball screens blitzed or top locked. And Florida was like feasting on backdoor cuts for a couple of weeks, Eric. They're like, oh, you want to lift your defense? All right, fine. We will back cut from the baseline. But UConn like kind of stayed with like Samson Johnson in that like low man hold down there. And it was disrupting a lot of like Florida's efforts to sort of baseline cut. And so Florida like did basically they switched that to some slips in the second half where they got guys up at the top of those horn sets or at the top of the screens, up by the elbow, and it looked like another ball screen, and then all of a sudden he slips back to the basket. Got a couple dunks that way. I thought those were nice plays, and they were big momentum plays. And then Florida, really like Will Richard legacy game is not getting talked about lots, but some of the defensive plays that Will Richard made, when I rewatched it, I was just like, man, like I know what's going to happen. I didn't know, like I hadn't seen it, right? But I knew the score progression. So like Walter Clayton has this mind-bogglingly bad turnover with 3:50 something remaining. And Will Richard gets back and forces a steal on solo ball, right? Like just forces a turnover, like reaches, gets the ball, goes off Solo's foot, and suddenly UConn had the ball up 3 with a chance to go up 5, and instead it's Florida's ball. Florida, the shot I mentioned when I first saw the score at Epcot, and then Caravan goes on the dribble handoff, and Richard just gets behind him, tips the ball out, and they get a run-out dunk, right? Like Will Richard legacy game plays. And I loved the video of Will's dad on CBS. So if you complained about Liam McNeely's mom, you have to at least give them credit for finding Will Richard's pops losing his mind. That was great stuff. That's what March Madness is all about. So credit Will Richard, who also hit some massive shots for Florida in the second half. And then Walt Clayton, like, okay, the first 3 was a pretty good look. The one that went to 62-61, the 70-64 3 that's been retweeted to infinity and beyond, I think at this point, that was just stupid. And it also bucked Walt's like tendency. Like when Walt makes those like sideways falling back threes, he's usually going left. And this one, he was going right. Like that shot was absolutely preposterous. I'm sorry. Like, so when I saw that, like, it doesn't even matter. Like I'd seen it on Twitter already, but to like see it and then get Raftery's first onions of the NCAA tournament, and like see Will Richards' reaction to just go hug him and like say something along the lines of like, I can't even believe you made that. Man, that was special stuff. So that was just a big time play by Will Clayton, who made a lot of big time plays down the stretch, right? He had 8 points in the final 4 minutes. So yeah, Florida went into the intermediate 4 media timeout down 3. But like, had I watched that live, I really would have felt after the Will Richard play where he forced the turnover on solo ball, I would have felt like, hey, Florida's fighting. They're going to get this game. I'm just being serious. And those were little mistakes that UConn had made all year, which is why they were an 8 seed, right? And so that's just kind of my overarching thought on the second half. Like, I know it's a host of thoughts kind of packaged together, but that's what I thought watching the second half. And I thought the film studies and the conversation with Brian, and Sam and Malik, that they're all going to illuminate some of those themes, I think.
So I do think one of the big stories was what Florida did in crunch time, going to that dribble handoff play in the middle of the floor, that gut dribble handoff play. Of course, like Walter Clayton hit the one just ridiculous 3 that you're talking about that wasn't so much like a, hey, look at this play that worked brilliantly for a wide open look. It was him feeling himself. But I did think that was a nice adjustment as well to kind of keep Walter Clayton from a position where he could get hard hedged or trapped, as opposed to like a typical high ball screen when you put Walter Clayton kind of under the rim or in the paint and then have him sprint up from underneath the ball or the big with the ball in his hands to get that dribble handoff. It's you put that the guard defending Walter Clayton in a situation where he has to trail. He can't really get into Walter Clayton's body. And then you do see a situation where if they do, and it didn't actually, it was the one play before, but Alex Connon had the ball and he was kind of anticipating his man going to hedge. So he actually faked the dribble handoff and kept it. And he kind of fumbled the ball, but that was a great read. And that's what's a great benefit of using that gut dribble handoff play, is that it's really hard to hedge. And if teams are going to try to hedge out, and you've got someone like Connon who was clearly thinking this way, he can keep. And if 2 go to Walter Clayton before he even has the ball, then Connon could have gone downhill and gone to the rim. So it was definitely nice to see the Gators find something in crunch time that's going to work, because as we know in March, a lot of these games are going to come down to who executes the best in the final minutes. I of course did an entire Patreon early about how you need to have shot making guards off the dribble to win in March. I wrote about it at Gator Country. I just believe in it. For so many reasons. I think everyone can see the way the game is being officiated right now in the NCAA tournament. Like, if you're going to win, you need guys who can make big shots off the bounce. And of course, Florida has one of, if not the best player in the country at doing so. So I think that's got to be the massive that's got to be the massive positive takeaway, in my opinion, from this game, beyond the intangible. This team survived and advanced. They got the wake up call they needed, et cetera, et cetera. I do think that the fact that they found something that really worked in crunch time, that's something you could do against a lot of different defenses. Like if Maryland ends up being close down the stretch, I think they could go to the same looks and it'll be solid. So as much as there was a great individual play by Walter Clayton, I do like that what Florida went to just put Walter Clayton in a situation where he's not going to turn the ball over. And again, I talked about it with Ralph, how we did get the full spectrum of the Walter Clayton experience. I mean, some of his first half turnovers were unfortunately terrible, but not uncharacteristic. That's just the matter. And to me, it's one of the things that I think is just what makes Walter Clayton great, is he has these turnovers that if Kyle Lofton threw them a couple years ago, or if Andrew Nemhard threw them a couple years ago, you'd be like, this is outrageous. Like, you can't have this. Like, you cannot have your point guard throwing these turnovers. And Walter Clayton can do it, and he's still an All-American. Like, it just shows how good Walter Clayton is. So we saw the the first half that wasn't so good, but man, in that second half, it was honestly a little bit of a reminder of like last year when he went off against Colorado, and of course the Gators dug themselves quite a big hole against Colorado, so it wasn't enough. But one of the things that, like, I don't want to say we are robbed of, but like if Florida found a way to win that game, it would be like one of the great NCAA tournament performances of all time. And Walter Clayton just showed that he has some of that magic again with what he did at the end.
Yeah, he really did. And yeah, I liked this comment about Elijah Martin because I thought Elijah had like two massive plays on free throw misses in the second half, which were like, those are the things that everybody loves Elijah Martin for, just hustle plays and competitiveness. I actually thought the one where he got the kind of offensive rebound and dunk and they did find his mom was less impressive than the one that came earlier, which was like in a scrum, he just kind of reached his hand through two big men and just ripped one out to Tommy Houck. And it ends up in a scramble and a Will Richard three. I thought that was arguably a bigger play. So, yeah, I mean, look, everybody has these games. Florida, the most similar team to this recently that this happened to, and maybe this is like the UNC bias in me creeping out, but like, so in 2017, North Carolina was down by 5 to Arkansas with 3 minutes and 20 seconds to go at the under 4 media timeout. And then they just came out and just ripped that game right from Arkansas. Like, they scored the last 12 points. Joel Berry hit 2 preposterous shots, Joel Berry. And then they got, Kennedy Meeks getting a huge offensive rebound and a putback. And like, they were off to the races. That second round game was obviously monstrous for them. They went to the Sweet 16 against a Butler team that everybody loved, and they just rolled that Butler team. And then they played an epic Elite Eight game with Kentucky, but they had like a fourth big man off their bench, Luke May, who of course hit just a monstrous shot that was the end of John Calipari's like best last chance to go to the Final Four. So, and then they won the national title at the Final Four. They beat Oregon and then Gonzaga, and they comfortably beat Gonzaga in the championship game. And I feel like that UNC team even profiles a little like this Florida team. Like, they were top 10 in offense. They were on the edge of the top 10 in defense. They were 40th in tempo. I pulled this stuff up. They got 41% of their misses back. Like, the profiles are really the same. And like, this Florida team plays a little like a great Roy Williams team. Like, they want to play quick. They don't turn the ball over a ton. They got waves of bigs, but they aren't necessarily like a feed it to the post team. They're still going to rely on guards. And then they have an absolute brilliant All-American shot maker, right? Walter Clayton Jr., Joel Berry. So there's some similarity there. And I do think sometimes doesn't mean, excuse me, I think Florida's destined to win the national title. They certainly could lose the next game. And in fact, the last time Florida had a thrilling moment like this in March and won, Chris Chio hit that shot, and then Florida lost a heartbreaker 2 days later to South Carolina. So very clearly, like, one thing doesn't carry over to the other. But man, just what an epic win. What a great win. What a great day for the program. And, it's huge. It's huge to get back to the Sweet 16. We have talked for, Voss and I are 7 years into this. This is our first Sweet 16. It's a podcast. And we've talked for 7 years about how the goal should always be to play on the second weekend. Because once you get there, I think really anything can happen. We have a ton of content coming up at patreon.com/FloridaBB Hour on Maryland. So, we're going to dive into that. We will do a little talk about it tonight just because we know who the opponent is. The first thing I'll say is that, they didn't have to travel far, although Derek Queen traveled, to get here, man. They rolled just down the road from Seattle. where they defeated Colorado State on a controversial buzzer beater by their lottery pick, Derek Queen, 72-71, and in probably the other game of the tournament that occurred on Sunday, Eric.
Yeah, that was I mean, I thought it was just, again, like, objectively an amazing game. Colorado State has that, like, Colorado State is like a fun mix of, like, I think they're awesome, but from a NCAA tournament standpoint, when they play against a high major team, they still have that, like, plucky underdog feel just because they're so undersized. And I feel like that's ultimately what was the difference. I really thought going into this game that Maryland's front court was going to just completely overwhelm Colorado State, and they didn't. I felt like down the stretch they did, and that's what got them back in the game when Colorado State really led for a lot of it. And then, of course, like, Derek Queen, someone who just is so talented, and got just even the fact, like, and I'm sure we can get into it. I mean, Maryland has 5 players that you need to know about, and so it's pretty quick to talk about all of them. But I mean, really quick, they've got 3 awesome guards and 2 awesome bigs, but they have 3 awesome guards. And when they needed a quick bucket, they went to one of their post players. So I think that tells you what what respect that Willard has for Queen. And again, I think that when you look at this matchup, I think the really interesting thing is 2 teams that play 3 guards and 2 bigs. This is a game without really wings, like, which is, again, kind of funny. Everyone's going to be 6'4" and under on the perimeter, and 6'9" or bigger in the front court. And I think that if you're a Florida fan who is, of course, concerned, because I think that Julian Reese and Derek Queen are fantastic, I do think you could look to the fact that Colorado State's undersized front court, undersized, under athletic, good players, don't get me wrong, but I think that their centers, probably 6'7" and 250 pounds, and they just weren't able to get busy in the way that I expected them to. So I think that that's kind of the 2 things that are interesting, is 2 rosters that I wouldn't say play the same way, but are kind of built the same way, with 2 centers on the floor and then 3 guards who can all make shots. And again, I think while Florida's shot making, particularly with Walter Clayton, is outstanding. I mean, Neil, you can correct me if you disagree, but I think the shooting edge goes to Maryland. Jacoby Gillespie, a player that the Gators had interest in, shot 207 threes this year. He's shooting 41% from 3. Rodney Rice is shooting 37% from 3. He shot 209 threes. And Miguel, who shot a little bit less, but takes a little bit of the tougher ones, taking 173 threes, and he's shooting 43%. So 41, 37, and 43%. And just, again, as reference, Walter Clayton taking a high degree of difficulty. He's taking 274. He's shooting 39%. Will Richard is shooting 36% on 205 attempts, similar to the Maryland players. And Elijah Martin, who has 206 attempts, is shooting 35%. So I would actually give the shooting edge to Maryland, but yeah, it's a matchup that I think was really juicy from the moment the bracket was out. We expected it, just due to Maryland having one of the front courts that we thought actually could really, really give Florida's issues. And I think this is going to be a very, very interesting game.
Yeah, one crazy thing about them, they shoot like 38% as a team from distance, and it's like 3 shooters. And I appreciate Nathan Shields' shout out here to get on Patreon. Rowdy Reptiles here, and it's well worth it. Thank you, and thank you for being a subscriber. Look, the Crab 5 is totally legit, man. They all add value in a different way when they're on the floor. They're perfectly complementary to one another, I think. Jacoby Gillespie has a 15% turnover rate. That's very good, actually, considering how much he has the basketball. He has struggled with turnovers in games against elite teams. It can be like kind of their one Achilles heel of that starting 5, because otherwise they are so wonderfully complementary to each other. You mentioned something. Miguel is a guy who hits the tough threes, And then, obviously Julian Reese isn't going to shoot threes. He's going to back you down. He can score in the block. He's great establishing deep post position, and he can do that because of the way they can move around Derek Queen, their 5-star freshman who was on that stupid Montverde team that probably could have made the NCAA tournament itself. I don't even think it's controversial take. Like, put that Montverde team in some conference, and they clearly would have gone to the NCAA tournament. As long as it's not a one big league where they lost their tournament final, right? They had Cooper Flagg and Derek Queen, and I don't know, a lot of really great players, right? But they can move Queen around. He's not really a threat to shoot the three. I saw some people talking about that. He's 6 for 31 on the year. He will shoot it if you leave him open.
And it's also worth noting 2 of those threes came in against Colorado State, and 2 of them came against Michigan in the Big Ten tournament.
Oh, there you go.
So he's had 2 games where he's hit 2 threes, and
right.
Other than that, so yes, I would. So it'll be interesting actually to see how Florida plays him, but not much of a shooter.
That is a great point. A great little anecdote bullet point there is that 4 of the 6 have come in the last 3 games. The Maryland fan would say, see, he's starting to make them. That would not be my approach as a coach. It would be like, fire away, big boy. But any 3 that he takes is one that Rodney Weiss, Miguel, and Gillespie don't take. I do think Florida has sort of a physicality edge against at least Gillespie and Rice. Miguel's a little different. He's kind of a bigger, thicker, rangier, more physical guard than the other 2. And I think, that to me is kind of interesting because he does definitely take more of the tough shots, and he also has, he takes less threes than the other 2 guys takes. He takes more 2s. He's taking more 2-point shots at the rim. So I would watch out for that. The only guy that they really have brought off the bench for any significant minutes in the NCAA tournament is Jordan Geronimo. Otherwise, it's those 5. And in fact, against Colorado State, all 5 starters played 32 minutes or more. And Geronimo, Deshaun Harris-Smith actually played 24 minutes against Grand Canyon, but that's very unusual for them.
Yeah, they won that one by 1,000, so they started
right. So they that game was so in hand for so long that they just let that be. And it's so unusual for them. In their other games against Sweet 16 competition, Deshaun Harris-Smith minutes were 12, 7, and then 17 against Michigan State. They must have had a matchup that they liked with him in that game. But really, it's Jordan Geronimo. They do have a kind of bigger, lengthier wingspan guy, Shajara Gapare, who transferred from Georgia Tech. It will be interesting to see if they play him a little just because of Florida's waves of bigs. My prediction is they will not. They will just roll with Reese and Queen. And even if there's foul trouble, they will continue to roll with Reese and Queen. One thing that I've seen that's common on, and I'm really not trying to wet blanket anyone. I think Florida has a better basketball team. And I think that Florida's best has been better than Maryland's best pretty much all year. But, it's a Sweet 16 and everybody's really good. And I've seen some people say, well, Florida will wear them down with their depth and they'll get to them and they'll get them in foul trouble. And all I'll say to that is that this Maryland team is just wonderful at not fouling. They committed 7 fouls against Colorado State. 7.
Wow.
The whole game. So it's not like, and now Colorado State is not Florida and they're not as physical. They're not as tough to guard as the Gators are. But I do think it's kind of worth noting that they're not a high foul team. In the Big Ten championship game against Michigan, a game they lost by 1 point, they committed 12 fouls the entire game. So they just really do a great job of defending without fouling. They're a top 10 team in the country defensively. And part of the reason for that is that, they don't put you on the free throw line. So you got to make your buckets and earn your buckets. Now, the Gators haven't been a particularly high free throw rate team, period. This season, they shot 32 free throws against UConn, only made 20 of them. But I would just kind of point out that, like, from a data standpoint, that's kind of interesting to me. Those are kind of my initial thoughts on Maryland. Kevin Willard, I think, is a very good coach. If you wanted some other chestnut that, I do think is interesting, is that I think Florida will sit in the gaps more in this game because of Jacoby Gillespie's ability to kind of penetrate and kick. As Kevin Willard's offense is just far less intricate than anything Danny Hurley has ever run. Like, it's a much more simplistic offense, and I think Florida can guard it without trying to get overly creative.
Yeah, so the things kind of offensively from Maryland are the difference in Reese and Queen, where Queen is much more of a face-up player. And again, I did a bunch of film on this on Patreon, so this will be great for those of you who will see this and get this in more detail. But again, Queen's someone, and I think you kind of also saw it on the game winner against Colorado, just what Queen's game is. And again, he got cut off on his face-up attempt and had to hit a crazy off balance attempt. So it's that wasn't like the best demonstration of his skill necessarily, but he's someone who, like, if he catches the ball around the free throw line and faces up, how's Florida going to play that? Are they going to let him play one-on-one, which I think they probably will, or will they have guys stunting and digging down and trying to help? That'll be something I'm really interested in. And then Julian Reese, who is left-handed and is just lethal getting to his left hand hook, like that, just that typical hook shot that a guy catches it on the right block and you know what he's trying to do. And even if you push him out to 8 or 9 feet, he can still hit that hook shot. I'll be interested to see if the Gators try to send a double team, again, dig down stunts on that, or what they try to do there. Again, with the primary element here to be concerned about being the fact that there's 3 elite 3-point shooters on the perimeter at all times. So how Florida chooses to guard those 2 players is going to be interesting, because again, as much as they're 2 guys that are really centers, I would say they definitely play differently. And then I'll be really interested to see how Florida plays pick and roll. Now, one of the things that I think was really fascinating about Maryland going into the NCAA tournament, and they're one of the teams that I had earmarked for, like, I thought I was wherever they were seated, I was like, I think I'm going to have them going a round or 2 further than what most people expect or what their seat expectation would be. Then they ran into the Gators bracket. That's going to be a little more challenging. But the reason that I really like them, in addition to the defense that's really good, in addition to the shooting, is offensively, they're one of the best pick and roll teams in the country. And defensively, they're one of the best pick and roll defenses in the country. And I think that that is like a great place to start with really evaluating anyone in college basketball. It's 30% of the game for most teams. So defensively, if you're going to see it 30% of the time, and offensively, you're going to run it 30% of the time, the teams that are like the best at 30% of the game are going to be really good. And for Maryland to have multiple really good ball handlers, and then have 2 big time screen setters in Derek Queen and Julian Reese, who both can, again, they kind of like somewhere between pick and pop and short roll, whatever you kind of want to call it. Like, they're not pick and pop shooters, but they'll often just kind of like find the space, whether it's a slight pick and pop or find themselves in the short roll, and they can catch from there. And then again, like I said, Derek Queen is as good as anyone in the country at facing up. So that's how they get him a lot of those touches. So again, people will remember early in the season in Patreon when I pointed out how Florida tries to have high tags on pick and rolls, or did early in the season. Like, that's going to be massive to try to take away that short roll to Derek Queen particularly. So that's going to be a major focus. And then again, defensively, Maryland's pretty conservative, but their guards are just so good at getting around screens. And that's where, that Walter Clayton's going to go into this game like every other game, ready to shoot 5 to 8 off the dribble threes coming off pick and roll. How Gillespie and Rice and Miguel are able to get over the top of the screen and stay connected to Walter Clayton, which I think they do such a just a really, really good job of. That's going to be massive. And again, they will drop, but it's not like Derek Queen is immobile. So he's someone who can drop, take away the roll, and then at the last second stunt out at a ball handler in the mid range. But it is a game where playing a drop, Walter Clayton is probably going to hypothetically be ready to get all kinds of shots. And it's just, this is going to be one of the better drop coverages that Florida's seen. And it's going to be a massive, it's going to just be paramount for Maryland and these guards to try to get around these screens, stay connected, and make sure there's nothing clean for Walter Clayton. So yeah, those are the things that I think are really good. And it's one of those things that I was kind of, watching Maryland throughout the year, and I'm like, I actually kind of really like how this team plays, and I really like their talent. And I kind of felt like I was like discovering them a little bit. And then I looked at KenPom, and they've been like top 15. So right now they're 10th in KenPom. I think they were 11th going into the round of 32 game, and they're up. So it's like, I thought it was like, I thought I had like the early, I was like, oh, this team's actually really good. And then I saw that the metrics actually do love them. And I think that again should speak to, while like you look at some of the other top 10 KenPom teams, even in that area, like a Wisconsin, St. John's has obviously dropped, like Purdue and Kentucky and Illinois, even like Michigan. These are teams that have gotten a lot of like national coverage and talk about being really good teams this year. And Maryland's better in the metrics than all of them. So yeah, I do think this is a major challenge. I feel like a lot of people, due to respect for UConn, due to UConn PTSD, that one felt like a game that they were really nervous for. And I almost feel like people are not treating Maryland with the same level of respect as they should. And hey, I'm not saying Florida's going to lose this game. I still will have Florida winning it, but yeah, it's just there's a lot to like about this Maryland team. And like I said, I would have had them advancing beyond this round if they were in pretty much any region other than Florida's.
Yeah, I thought so too. And I know I talked about it a little bit when I did my bracket show. How I thought this would be, if this game happened, it would be Florida's toughest matchup in the regional, just because I love the way that this group of five plays together. Evan Mia has this starting five as one of the 10 most efficient starting fives in the country. That should surprise no one, given they really only play 6 or 7 guys. They better be really efficient. They don't defend. They defensive rebound fine. They don't really offensive rebound much, which I know is hard to believe when you have Derek Queen and Julian Reese, but they're like 150th in the country in that. They're not terribly tenacious at getting back on the glass, mostly because they try to get back on defense and balance the floor, which Kevin Willard has done at like every stop that he's been at. This is the farthest that Kevin Willard has been in the NCAA tournament, which surprised me, given just what a nice career he's had as a head coach. Yeah, I mean, this team could have been they could have even been more lethal. Like, I want to get into like too much portal conversation, but like for a while they were the front runner for Chas Lanier too. And like ultimately Rick Barnes just convinced him that even though Tennessee didn't recruit him at all, he should come back home and play for his dream school now that they wanted him. But for a while, Willard was winning the argument that like, they didn't want you to begin with. Why would you go there? And also we have more NIL, both of which were true things. And it almost made a huge difference. So imagine that team with Chas Lanier, right? They'd be even better. The other thing I'll say about them is that, look, they aren't terribly battle tested. And I think that's fair. Like, I know they played in the Big Ten, but like Eric has repeatedly brought up, like Florida's kind of benefiting at times from the unbalanced schedule. And it is interesting, to say the least, that Maryland did not have more like hyper competitive games based on the way that their Big Ten schedule kind of played out, right? Like they played Purdue very early in conference play because the Big Ten starts conference play way back in December. They lost that game. And then they never saw the Boilermakers again, right? So that's one Sweet 16 team that they only played one time and they never saw again. They played UCLA at home in early January, never saw the Bruins again. like beat them, but never saw them again. They did play Illinois twice. I don't think Illinois is very good. I never thought Illinois was very good. They crushed Illinois twice. Those are probably their most like impressive statement victories, to be quite honest. I know they beat Michigan in Ann Arbor on March 5th on what was Michigan's senior day. Super impressive win, I think. But the reality is they went and lost to Maryland a couple weeks later when Maryland didn't turn the ball over 16 times. So big reason they won that game against Michigan was terribly sloppy with the ball against a defense that, isn't super disruptive, to be honest. But Maryland takes care of the ball. So it doesn't matter that they don't produce a ton of steals because it doesn't really matter. Anyway, look, we got somebody, Jared, telling us, Norlander and Parrish only mentioned UF as an afterthought this week. Yeah, well, they both picked that exactly. They both picked Maryland to win this game before the tournament. And so, I think they're sticking with their guns on that. I think there is a chance that Florida rolls in this game. I also think that, Maryland also is coming off a super emotional win and will be super juiced up and ready to go and play. For me, I just kind of feel like Florida needs the best version of Alex Condon to show up in San Francisco. He did not show up in Raleigh. If Derek Queen's facing up, Alex Condon has to be better in those matchups, or get Micah Handlockton out there and let him try to bother him some. And then Ruben Chinyelu and Handlockton and whoever it is down low battling with Julian Reese, they've got to punish Maryland for not crashing the glass and trying to get a ton of offensive rebounds. They've got to win defensive rebounding battles and get some offensive rebounds and second possession opportunities of their own, because Maryland's a real good defense. Ultimately, I think it's a tight game. And again, I'm just going with Florida having the superior collection of talent, even though I think maybe this will be one of the games where you could argue that the most talented player is on Maryland's team, which hasn't been the case in a Florida game very often. I guess you could have made that argument with McNeely too, but anyway, I do think Florida wins narrowly. I think it's going to be an absolute dogfight. And I'll make a hot take. I don't think that either team that Florida could play in the Elite Eight can beat Florida. So there's my hot take. I don't think Texas Tech is a team that scares Florida very much. They certainly don't scare me. JT Toppin is awesome, man. He's so good. But Florida has multiple guys that kind of match up nicely with him. And that's one where their depth wins out. And then Arkansas, Florida played healthy Arkansas with Thoreau and Boogie Flan and John L. Davis, and they beat them in Fayetteville pretty handily. So no reason to think Florida wouldn't dominate an SEC opponent in the Elite Eight. So this is a massive one for the program on Thursday night, Eric. I'll let you finish with some closing thoughts.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think Maryland is better than either of those two teams. And I'll also just point out this to close. And this is part of the reason that people can probably you probably could have reverse engineered the fact that Maryland is 10th in KenPom with 8 losses by what I'm about to tell you. But these are the scores or how much they lost by in their 8 losses. They lost to Marquette by 4. They lost to Purdue by 5. They lost to Washington by 6. That's their one bad loss this year. They lost to Oregon by 4. They lost to Northwestern by 2 in overtime. They lost to Ohio State by 3. They lost to Michigan State by 3. And they lost in the Big Ten tournament to Michigan by 1. So they only really play close games. Well, I shouldn't say that, because they do have a lot of wins by Martin. They can blow teams out. You mentioned they blew Illinois out in the Big Ten tournament.
Twice.
Like you said, they blew them out twice. They blew them out the regular season in the Big Ten tournament. They beat. You can look up and down their schedule. They did a good job of actually really. Also talking to why they did really well in KenPom is anytime they played a team in the 50s or 60s in KenPom in the Big Ten, that lower middle of the pack, they beat them by 20, like they did to what were some of those games? I know they killed Iowa, they killed USC, whatever it was. So yeah, so that is one of the things that they have not yet been blown out by anyone. They only play close games, and they have fallen on the wrong side of some of those close games, which is obviously they just pulled out the big one in Colorado State. But just looking at the fact that they've hung with, they've gotten a bunch of, solid wins on the schedule, nothing marquee. They have one bad loss to Washington, but even then their other losses were all like I read them out, 1 or 2 possession games. So I don't think that they're ever going to be scared if this game is close. I think they can keep it close. But anyways, I think that I think this one's huge for the reason we said. If they win this one, I will probably be feeling quite good about their opportunity to make a Final Four. So Neil, I guess we should probably talk. We didn't talk about this, but in the situation where Florida wins this game, which I believe we are both suggesting we think will happen. I will certainly be doing something on Patreon between the Sweet 16 and Elite 8 games based on whoever Florida is playing. And again, this is just another example with this quick turnaround. I'm not sure if we're going to have something on the regular podcast feed, but there will absolutely be multiple things on
a
the
wealth
Patreon.
of Patreon content.
So that's just, again, I don't, not trying to hold you all hostage, but we're at the point where this is a Patreon product that we do, and the podcast we put out on the podcast feed is really bonus to what the primary thing we do is, and that's the Patreon content. So that'll be a priority, and man, I hope we're doing all that content. We'll still have a lot of content, even if the unmentionable happens. But if with the Florida win, there will certainly be even extra stuff. So anyways, for so many of you that have subscribed recently, we are so thankful for you, and of course so thankful to all of you that have been subscribing since we first launched. And I hope everyone enjoys the Patreon content that's going to come in the next few days, and has an awesome time watching the game Thursday. I mean, take advantage of these moments. I mean, I hope that this becomes something you look forward to every single year when the Gators are in a second weekend, but you just never know. You never know what can happen. So I hope you really enjoy it. So go Gators and keep attacking closeouts.